Song for Autumn by Mary Oliver, who's such an amazing poet. This particular phrase, don't you imagine the leaves? Think about how comfortable it will be to touch the earth instead of the nothingness of air and the endless freshets of wind. I think the reason it landed for me, so to speak, is that it does feel like we're blowing in the wind oftentimes. And we are always looking for that balance of not too comfortable, but not too open. Too stodgy, too predictable is boring, and too unpredictable tends to be a little bit scary and it might put us into hypervigilance. And then when we have all of the things that we can't control, sometimes we just need a rest. So that was what the pull was to share that line of that poem. So if we were to focus on things that we've shared, most of us here have had a new job, or maybe it was a new school or something like that. But if you were to bring that to mind, probably something already popped in. And if you're older, you've maybe had several jobs, so you've had several first days. What comes up in your body and in your mind? What memories come in when you think about going into a new job, the first day at a new job? And it's usually a mixed bag. We usually are hopefully a little excited that we've got this new job. It was something that we wanted. We have some anticipation about what it might be like. We might have some worst case scenario things going on, and maybe we're trying to be positive. We don't know what's going to happen. And so we're working with that. So we're excited. We have some trepidation. But take a couple of breaths and settle into your body as we're doing all of these. It's helpful to be aware how it feels in our body. And probably most of us have a fairly similar looking forward to. We might have a different experience on the job. It might be a job that we're really well qualified for and that we're really welcome at. It might be something that we don't really feel very welcome at or that we're not really wanting to do. But the excitement, the trepidation, the not knowing is something that we pretty much all have experienced to some extent. And then to bring on a different one, if you were to look around the room that you're in right now, if you're in your home or in a familiar environment, some people live in environments where they really feel safe and they enjoy where they live. Other times we're not in that situation. Right now, if you could notice a situation where you didn't feel 100% happy to be there. First thing that came to mind for me was a basement suite I lived in. It was cold and dark, and I really wanted the sunshine. And then now where I live, there's wall-to-wall windows just about. What's your experience around that? Environments that are familiar, that you were really happy to be in, and really not as happy or not as safe? Notice if you take a couple of deep breaths, let your body soften again, what that feels like. And most of us have known the anticipation of going on a vacation, and sometimes we might have little snatches of memory that come in that was like, oh, yeah, that was so amazing. But then we also have the lineups in the airports if we were flying and all of those things too. If you've had that experience, probably you have a lot in common with other people who've also been on vacations, although the details would certainly be different. And then some of the common, without the specifics, we've all been included, whether that was at a job or on a vacation. We've all been rejected. We've all had times of grief and loss, and we've all had times of feeling love and joy. And we all want comfort and safety. If you were to bring to mind somebody that experiences the world a little bit differently than you do, maybe it's somebody in your neighborhood that's on the other side of the political spectrum that you are. Not somebody who's really threatening, but just somebody who really thinks differently than you do. And how might they experience some of those same things? You might use an example of the job or the vacation or something. What might be, if you were to be able to actually put yourself in their position, how might they experience that? And how much of that has to do with whether they're in a fight, flight, or freeze. If you go into a social situation, for instance, and you mostly go into a protective mode, your experience is going to be very different from someone who goes into more of a fight mode. And we probably all know people who, whenever we see them, this isn't right, and they're really angry, and we have a response to that as well. We tend to not be as open-hearted, and it might be that you're the one who feels angry a lot of the time, or who are in that fight response more of the time. These nervous system responses aren't something we're doing wrong or right. They're just responses that we all have. Whoever you're thinking about, it might be someone who cuts you off in traffic. It might be something simple like that. What's going on with them? What's the history that they're bringing to this moment? And what are you assuming about them? Many years ago, I was driving with some other people on the way back from Banff. I lived in Calgary. And it was a Sunday afternoon, and there was really a long lineup to get into the city. I don't know what was going on, if it was just volume, but there was one person in a Jeep that was coming along on the shoulder on the left side, honking. And I noticed that other people in line were honking at them, or some were even pulling out onto the shoulder to make it difficult for them to get by. And I was assuming probably the same thing most people were, is they're trying to jump the line. And that's not fair. And then as they passed, there was a very pregnant woman in labor in the back of the Jeep. And it was like, the whole thing just changed. So it's just an example of what we bring into a situation, how we make assumptions about other people that may or may not be accurate. I mean, it might be. We all know people who jump the line, and we don't like that. But notice just now how you're feeling, what you're thinking. Take a few breaths. And would it be true to say, I'm interested to know what their experience is? Whoever them is, whoever is different from you right now. Part of this for me is that I want to be able to keep my heart more open. So I want to be able to see what it is that closes me down. And one of them is sometimes I don't really care what's happening with the other person. I just want them to stop doing that thing I don't want them to do. So I think that's a pattern of mine that I still work with. On this screen here, there's a bunch of opposite experiences. So we have a school child who's bored and maybe not doing that well in school. We have a scholar who's obviously really doing well. We have people who like Aerosmith. We have people who like opera. We have the experience of the prom queen and king. We have the experience of the kid who's bullied, who's never going to be the prom king. We have being included in many different formats, whether it's school or work or socially. And then people who feel really left out. That picture of that person standing there in front of the riot police. And we don't know by looking at the police in their riot gear what they are thinking or feeling. Probably there's a variety of things. We have a sense of what she's doing. She's standing tall for justice. There's something she really cares about. And also, that's a pretty scary situation for her to be in, too. Let's take a moment here to think about other ways in which your experience might be very different from someone else's, that in a similar setting. If we were to think about some of the negative things we think, maybe a child in school who's having difficulty, dyslexic or not doing well academically, or maybe there's too much trauma at home and they're not getting enough sleep, whatever it might be, they might be very jealous of that child who's confident at the front of the room and always gets good grades. Or they might not have that. They might think, well, I'd like to get to know more about how to do that. What are some of the ways that you might be thinking about that? if you're in that in group, do you think about the people who are not included? And how might you explain that to yourself? And are you thinking things like, well, they just need to make more of an effort and they would be included, or they never say hello when I say hello to them, so they're stuck up, or this is just an exploration to see some of the things that we think about when we're in these situations, how we explain that to ourselves. And if you were to think of the situation that you're thinking about in terms of, I am really interested to know more about what's going on for that other person, and try to not go into judgment around this. The inner critic can get pretty loud, but also it would be unusual for us to feel left out. Maybe there's a bully at work, or maybe we're just really anxious. I know for me as a lesbian, unless you were out at work, which I eventually was, but have to talk about my weekend without pronouns because I didn't want to really say she instead of he, which would be the heteronormative assumption. There was an awkwardness around that. I was never really fully engaged in the way that other people might be. And noticing, are you going into more of a fight response, more of a flight? I don't really care what they think about me anyway, or more of a shutdown or freeze? Let's come back into regulation. Notice how you feel, notice what's going on inside. This is an example if you've ever been camping, or maybe you've thought about it, or maybe you really deliberately stayed away from it. But I used to love to camp because I used to like to get out of the city and get away from all the people and be in nature. And I noticed that a lot of times in a campground, that wasn't the goal of a lot of the people who would come. So probably 80% of the people wanted the quiet. And then there'd be some group of people who would come and had a bunch of beer and they turn on the loud music and they're having a lot of fun. And I was always too mad to enjoy the fact that they were having fun because they were ruining my time. I really worked with that. And one of the ways that I fixed that, so to speak, is that I bought a little piece of land where I could be in the wilderness and nobody could bother me. But that's not always an option. It's often not an option when we are in conflict with somebody else in our environment. But I learned a lot about my own mind. My partner would often like, well, whatever, they're here, let's go join them. I'm like, no, they shouldn't be doing this. Notice if that's something that it's another way that we could open up to looking at that. Definitely a way that my heart shut down. I didn't care what their experience was. I wanted them to be quiet. This is true. People have different interests. We have different views and different values, and not all of them are threatening to us. If you were to think about whatever examples have come forward, or maybe there would be something new, think about a person, or maybe a couple of people, but make it kind of personal. What do you have in common with that person? Brene Brown talked about some floods in Texas where she lives, and she said when it came to people getting out their boats and going house to house and rescuing people, nobody cared if you were Republican or Democrat. We were all in the same situation. We all needed to survive the storm, and we all wanted to help each other. So that was the predominant experience, was that everybody wanted to survive and also to help other people. Many people wanted to help others. So that's a big situation where oftentimes those divides will become much less important. But if you're thinking about whatever situation you're working with, what do you have in common with that person? And what is different? And as you're letting that sink in, notice as well what it feels like in your body. what you have different might mean that you don't get to have it your way, that you don't get to have that quiet camping experience. That's such a simple example in some ways. But does that make the other side wrong? Or is it just different? Does it mean that they're a threat? Sometimes it is. Somebody drives really fast, they're maybe not as safe. Somebody driving too slow sometimes isn't as safe either. We have this world that we live in where we have all of these differences. If you were to say, I'm really interested in knowing more, notice what comes up in your mind. Might be, no, I'm not interested. They're wrong. Or it might be, well, I know I should be interested, but notice what's coming up. We'll take a minute or so for this before we finish. Are you really interested? What are the conditions around that? Well, I am interested, but not if they're going to be yelling at me. These aren't the big social justice divides necessarily. It's a little bit more simple, more everyday. In my everyday life, when I come across somebody who's different. And then see if you could regulate. Notice your body and your breath. Let yourself settle back. How open is your heart right now? And how willing do you think they are to be interested in your perspective? This is not one of those ones where we're going to wrap it up in a neat bow. The reality it is there's a lot of people, a lot of situations where we really have a different view. Some people really value one thing, some people don't value that at all. And yet we still have some common values. We all want to be safe. We all want to be free from harm. We all want to be connected. We want to be included. Let's let the inquiry go now and just tune into that. We do have some common human values of wanting to be here, wanting to be included, wanting to be safe. And for those of us doing this inquiry, we also have the value of having an open heart. And that can be very painful and very hard. We could at least offer ourselves and each other compassion and kindness. This is an advanced practice to be keeping our hearts open when things are difficult.